He was just a quiet man in a hoodie, shooting alone in the corner until a Navy SEAL recruit caught a glimpse of the faded tattoo on his forearm, and everything changed. Who was he? And why did the room fall silent the moment he spoke? What followed left even the toughest soldiers in awe. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The gravel crunched beneath the worn boots of a man who had walked that path too many times to count. Every Monday morning at exactly 6:45 a.m., just before the Arizona sky began to shift from violet to gold, he arrived. Never early, never late. There was no fanfare, no sound, but the low hum of wind skimming across the flat desert and the soft shuffle of boots meeting dust. He wore the same thing every time. A gray hoodie, sun-faded and loose around the shoulders. The sleeves were often rolled just past the wrists, revealing forearms weathered by more than age. His jeans were stiff with dust, not the kind that came from fashion distressing, but from real-use hiking trails, crawling under vehicles, sleeping on cold ground. A single strap crossed his back diagonally, holding an old tactical backpack, dark green and battered by time. No patches, no brand. The staff at the range had gotten used to seeing him. They didn't know his name. Not really. On the logbook, he signed simply as K. Donovan. No last name, no ID, just those two initials, written in a firm, controlled hand. He always paid in cash, exact change, no eye contact, no words beyond a curt nod if acknowledged. New employees always asked the same questions. Who was he? A retired detective, maybe? Some said ex-Marine. Others guessed truck driver, long-haul type, probably carried his entire life in that backpack. Nobody could say for sure. He never spoke more than a word, never stayed past his session, and never offered a smile. Just one thing was certain. He always took Lane 9. Lane 9 sat in the back corner of the facility, dimmer than the rest, partly due to a flickering overhead light that management never bothered fixing. Most shooters avoided it. It felt too far from the action, too isolated, almost claustrophobic. But for him, it was perfect. He moved through the corridor with quiet purpose, never distracted, never hesitant. His boots made a soft thud against the concrete, slow and steady, a rhythm like a metronome that only he could hear. When he reached Lane 9, he placed his backpack down with deliberate care, like he was setting down something sacred. From it, he pulled a pistol case, matte black and scuffed, a simple rag. And an old metal thermos dinged and dull, but tightly sealed. He unzipped the case and retrieved a steel gray 1911 pistol. No accessories, no rail-mounted lights, no aftermarket grips. The metal was worn near the slide, the kind of wear that doesn't come from neglect but from thousands of repetitions. The weapon had seen years, decades, maybe, and it had been kept alive by discipline. The man didn't talk. He didn't adjust earbuds or scroll through music. He didn't nod along to invisible rhythms. He sat on the plastic bench, hunched slightly forward, elbows on his knees, hands resting loosely, and he waited. The range didn't open for live fire until 7 a.m. sharp. He never tested the boundary, never tried to sneak in a shot early. He simply sat there, staring downrange as if the silhouette target was already there and he was reading it like scripture. From the break room window, some of the staff used to watch him during those 15 minutes before the firing line opened. They'd pour coffee, lean on the counter, and whisper theories like teenagers around a campfire. One guy swore he had to be a federal marshal in retirement, said the way he handled his gear was too precise, too neat. Another suggested, survivalist. Maybe he lived off-grid and came here to check his aim every Monday before disappearing back into the desert. A younger staff member once joked, he's probably a fiction writer researching his next novel, but none of them had ever dared ask. Something about the way he carried himself made it clear. Curiosity wasn't welcome. He didn't intimidate with size or presence. He wasn't tall or bulky. In fact, his frame was lean, almost understated. But the stillness, the complete absence of wasted movement or nervous tics, spoke louder than any words could. It was the stillness of someone who had long ago learned to be dangerous quietly. At exactly 7 a.m., the overhead buzz signaled live fire was open. That's when he moved. No fanfare, no warming up. He stood, loaded 5 rounds into the magazine with smooth, mechanical ease, and stepped forward into the lane. His shooting stance was traditional, nothing flashy, nothing you'd see in tactical YouTube videos or competition reels. Just squared shoulders, steady breath, and a calm grip that spoke of experience far beyond civilian training courses. Then came the shots. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. Reset. Not a single round strayed. Each one struck the center of mass with surgical precision. The groupings weren't tight, they were indistinguishable. You couldn't tell one hole from the next. The paper targets absorbed the rounds like they'd been cut out by a laser. There was no celebration, no reaction. Just a step back, a slow unload, and another calm reload. Over and over, the rhythm continued. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. Reload. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't theatrical. It was inevitable. Like watching someone chop wood in the dead of winter or stitch a wound in the field, just work that needed to be done. Occasionally, a late-arriving customer would pass behind Lane 9 and glance at his target. More than one person stopped mid-step, stunned into silence by the tight black hole in the center of the silhouette. But he never turned around, never acknowledged the attention. If he heard the murmurs, he didn't show it. One of the instructors, a former Army weapons trainer, once paused his own session just to watch. After a few minutes, he leaned toward another staff member and whispered, "That guy doesn't shoot like a civilian. That's decades of muscle memory. He's not practicing. He's remembering." But remembering what? Nobody knew. And the man in Lane 9 wasn't offering any answers. Instead, he kept firing 3, 2, reset, while the early desert sun finally began to spill through the high windows, tracing faint shadows on the wall behind him, like the ghost of a past too heavy to name. By 7:30 a.m., the rest of the range would begin to fill. Regulars arrived with their tactical gear, bright cases, and conversations about optics, drills, or whatever YouTube trainer they were following that week. Laughter echoed in bursts. Targets were set up. Rounds slammed into paper downrange with erratic timing. But none of that touched Lane 9. Even in the rising chorus of shots and voices, his space felt separate, quieter, deeper, almost reverent. He didn't rush, didn't compete. He moved like someone who had nothing to prove but everything to preserve. His magazine changes were fluid. His grip never faltered. His breathing remained steady, like a clock ticking in the background of chaos. Some mornings, people tried to speak to him. A head nod. A casual morning. He'd acknowledge them with the slightest lift of his chin, but that was it. He never invited conversation, never lingered in the lobby after finishing. Once he was done, usually by 8:30 a.m., he packed his gear in reverse order, thermos first, pistol last, always the same. And he left the way he came, boots brushing gravel, shoulders relaxed, hoodie pulled just low enough to cast a shadow over his eyes. It was routine, yes, but it was more than that. It was ritual, something sacred, and though no one dared say it aloud, the people who worked there began to notice a subtle shift. Other shooters started choosing lanes farther from Lane 9, not out of fear, but out of respect. The staff stopped referring to him as just the quiet guy. Instead, they used softer tones. "He's in again," they'd say, or simply, "He's here." Nobody knew his full name. Nobody knew where he came from. But they all knew one thing. Lane 9 wasn't just another spot on the range anymore. It was his. And every time he stepped into it, something unspoken happened. Something that made even the loudest voices lower, even the cockiest shooters pause mid-draw. Because whether they knew it or not, they were all learning something. And soon, a group of fresh-faced SEAL recruits full of swagger and noise would walk through that same door, laugh a little too loud, and challenge the silence. They had no idea what waited for them at the end of that range. The silence didn't last long. At 8:05 a.m., the range's heavy front door buzzed open with a loud electronic snap. It was followed by the unmistakable clatter of boots, laughter, and the sharp scrape of metal cases dragged across tile. 6 Navy SEAL trainees strode into the lobby like they owned the building, their energy cutting through the quiet like a blade. They were young, disciplined, and full of noise. Their presence didn't ask permission, it demanded attention. They had come in from Coronado for an off-base advanced firearms detour, something to break up their grueling training cycle. The trip was unofficial, squeezed into a rare free window. They were here to blow off steam, sharpen their group dynamics, and though they wouldn't say it out loud, show off a little. Reggie led the group. Tall, thick through the chest and shoulders, he moved like someone who'd always been picked first. His camo cap was pushed back on his head, revealing close-cropped hair and a self-assured grin. He slapped one of the others on the back and pointed at the target display like he was already imagining his name on the range's leaderboard. Petty, the youngest, came next. Barely out of his teens, he was wiry and fast-talking, with a sarcastic streak that both amused and irritated the others. He was the kind of guy who always had a comment ready, always looking to turn a moment into a punchline. He tugged his ball cap low and whistled when he saw how empty the range was. "Whole place is dead," he said, grinning. "Either we're too early or civilians in Arizona sleep late." Miles, Grant, and the others fanned out behind them, dropping their gear loudly on nearby benches. Someone cranked the vending machine handle, another cranked up a Bluetooth speaker until a staff member behind the desk shot them a sharp look. "Keep it respectful," the employee warned. Reggie raised his hands mockingly. "All good, man. We're professionals." Then his eyes drifted toward lane 9, the farthest lane, darker than the rest. And seated there like a ghost from another time was the same quiet figure. Keanu hadn't turned his head when the recruits entered. He hadn't moved at all. He simply sat forward, elbows on knees, reloading calmly, his movements exact. From where the trainees stood, he didn't look like much. Just a guy in a gray hoodie with lines in his face and a dusty thermos at his side. No tactical gear, no body armor, no patches or insignia. Just a quiet presence. Petty leaned closer to Reggie and whispered, "Probably teaches woodworking on YouTube, or has a conspiracy podcast in his garage." Reggie smirked. "Looks like he hasn't updated his Glock since 1997. They laughed, shrugged, and turned back to their gear. Whatever the man in lane 9 was doing, it didn't concern them. Not yet. Their instructor hadn't shown yet, and the group wasn't the type to sit still. After checking in and stowing their gear, they claimed lanes 3 through 7 like it was home turf. Grant called out targets. Miles began loading magazines. Reggie flexed his shoulders like he was prepping for a show. Petty, never far from a smart comment, looked around and muttered, just loud enough for the front desk to hear, "Let's see if the locals can keep up." They weren't being rude, not intentionally, but they were young, hungry, and unshakably sure of themselves. The kind of confidence that comes from being forged in elite training, but not yet tempered by failure. While the others started dry runs and drills, Reggie took his time adjusting his grip. His hands were strong, fast, and deliberate. He fired 5 clean rounds into the silhouette at lane 5, paused, then added 2 more for effect. The grouping was good, tight enough to impress, wide enough to give him room to brag. He stepped back and tapped the control to reel the target in, then turned toward the others with a wide grin. "Check that out. I'm telling you, I'm ready for quals already." Miles gave an approving nod. "You've been ready? Dude, you were born ready," Petty added, voice dripping with playful sarcasm. They all laughed again, but the sound didn't echo quite the same way anymore. Something about the air was different. Behind them, down at the end, Keanu was already standing again. He hadn't moved when they laughed, hadn't looked up, hadn't responded, but now he was firing. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause. The sound was sharp, deliberate, not louder than anyone else's, but cleaner somehow. Like each shot landed with its own quiet authority. No wasted energy, no dramatic flinch, just the steady rhythm of someone who wasn't rushing to make a point. Petty's head tilted slightly as he noticed the spacing. "That guy's consistent," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Reggie scoffed. "Anyone can hit paper with enough time and an old-school 1911. Doesn't mean he's done anything real." Still, his eyes strayed down the lane again. Keanu didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did. But if he did, it didn't matter. His focus never wavered. He stepped back, reloaded without a sound, then resumed. 3. Pause. 2. Pause. Reset. The target hadn't moved, but it was no longer just paper. It was becoming something else entirely: evidence, proof, a silent language only a few would recognize. But the recruits weren't there yet. They still laughed, still joked, and they had no idea they were standing in the shadow of someone who'd already walked through the fire they were still learning to play with. Reggie shook out his shoulders again and fired another round of shots, faster this time. His grouping was still tight, but one shot strayed low. He clicked his tongue and adjusted his stance, clearly annoyed. The others didn't notice. They were too busy debating calibers now. Miles argued that a 9mm offered better control under stress. Grant countered that the prescribed Dantras .45 had more stopping power. Petty, always looking to stir the pot, shrugged and said, "Doesn't matter what you shoot if you can't hit anything." Laughter followed, but it was quieter this time. Because behind the debate, behind the sarcasm and the clatter of fresh magazines being slapped into place, that rhythm continued. 3 shots. Pause. 2 shots. Pause. Reset. The sound was like a clock ticking in the corner of a crowded room. Not intrusive, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. No flash, no aggression, just precision. Just presence. Reggie's eyes flicked sideways. The man hadn't changed position once. His hands moved like water over metal. His face remained calm, unreadable, carved from something harder than stone but gentler than pride. No huffing, no posture, just form. Petty took another look down the lane and frowned. "You guys see that grouping?" Reggie followed his line of sight. At first glance, the target at lane 9 looked like it had a neat circle at the chest. Nothing unusual. But as the seconds passed, it became clear there weren't multiple holes. Just one. A single ragged tear, growing darker and deeper with every shot. Round after round, cutting through the same point, like the paper had been pre-marked by a machine. Miles blinked. "That's not normal." Reggie exhaled hard, jaw tightening. "It's luck. He's going slow, taking his time." Petty didn't say anything. The group returned to their drills, but the mood had changed. There were fewer jokes, less volume. They were still confident, but something had crept in, something they hadn't expected. Not fear. Not respect. Not yet. Just confusion. Because the man in lane 9, the one they dismissed as a civilian, a nobody, wasn't just hitting the bullseye. He was redefining it, and he hadn't even spoken a word. The only real sound in the room now was the rhythm of Keanu's shots. Not loud, not rushed, just steady, deliberate, and perfectly spaced. It was like listening to a metronome made of steel and discipline. The recruits kept firing, but the joking had started to thin out. Eyes drifted. Curiosity replaced mockery, even if none of them admitted it out loud. Then, it happened. Keanu stepped back from the firing line and reached into his backpack. The soft cotton of his hoodie stretched across his arm as he grabbed a fresh box of ammo. As he turned, the sleeve slid up just an inch. No more, but it was enough. The overhead light caught on the skin of his forearm, and there, half hidden beneath faded scars and sun-worn flesh, was a tattoo. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't inked for show, but it was unmistakable. A trident. The mark of a Navy SEAL. It wasn't new or glossy like most of the ones the younger operators got. It was weathered, aged, and partially faded into the creases of his skin. Not placed for vanity, placed for memory. Petty saw it first. He had been walking back to his bench with a handful of spent casings when his eyes landed on the ink. The smile on his face froze. The joke halfway to his lips died in his throat. He blinked, stared harder, like maybe his mind was playing tricks, but it wasn't. He stopped walking. Reggie noticed and called over without turning. "What? You forget how to count to 5? Petty didn't answer. He just kept looking. Reggie finally turned and followed his gaze. "What's he staring at now?" Grant asked. Petty pointed without lifting his hand fully. "Look at his arm," he said under his breath. The others turned their heads toward lane 9. Keanu was reloading, calm, patient. His movements had no urgency to them, but every action was clean, practiced. The sleeve of his hoodie was still caught just high enough to expose the trident. A breeze from the air vent stirred the edge, but it didn't fall. The ink stayed visible. Reggie narrowed his eyes and scoffed. "Come on, Petty. That could be fake. You can buy that stuff online now. Etsy's full of wannabe gear." Petty didn't look away. "That's not new ink." "So?" Reggie shrugged. "Still doesn't mean anything." Petty took a step forward, his voice lowered to a near whisper. "It's real. You can tell. That's old school placement, not something you flash around." Keanu didn't flinch, didn't react. He simply slid the magazine into place and stepped back into position, never acknowledging the eyes on him. He raised the pistol again. 3 shots. Pause. 2 shots. Reset. The same rhythm. The same silence. But now, the air had changed. No one said anything for a few seconds. The room wasn't quiet. Not completely there. Were still shots going off from other lanes. Brass hitting the floor. Range fans humming. But something deeper had gone still. The kind of silence you don't hear with your ears but feel in your chest. Reggie scoffed again. But this time it didn't land with the same energy. "It's probably just some vet who did one tour and wants to look cool," he muttered, trying to keep the mood light. But nobody laughed. Petty took another step forward, still watching Keanu's arm. "Nah, look at the scars," he whispered. "Tattoo's not even clean anymore. That's old. He's had that thing for decades." Reggie folded his arms. "You gonna walk over and ask for his DD 214 while you're at it?" Grant looked between the two of them. "No offense, but that grouping he's got, that's not some poser routine. I've never seen that kind of consistency." Petty's voice got quieter. "Neither have I." Reggie didn't respond. His eyes were locked on lane 9 now. Keanu was moving again. Not hurried, not dramatic, just precise. He was already inserting a new mag with that same calm rhythm, each movement like muscle memory baked into his bones. He wasn't performing for anyone. He wasn't trying to impress. That's what made it worse. He didn't care that they were watching. And now that they had seen the trident, now that the quiet man in the hoodie wasn't just a random shooter anymore, everything felt heavier, more real. Petty finally broke the tension. "I think we need to figure out who this guy Island." "No," Reggie said sharply. "Let it go. Doesn't matter." But it did, and they all knew it. Miles stepped up beside them, having heard enough to follow the thread. "You guys sure that's what it was?" Petty nodded slowly. "Yeah, it was the real deal. He still wears it like it means something," Grant added. "Not for show, for memory." Reggie adjusted his stance and turned back toward his lane. "Doesn't mean he's anyone important. He's probably just holding on to old stories." Still, he didn't fire right away. His Glock stayed down at his side for a moment too long. His grip tightened, knuckles showing white. For the first time all morning, Reggie looked unsettled. Because deep down, he understood what Petty had seen. And no matter how many jokes he made, the man in lane 9 wasn't just another shooter anymore. He was a question none of them were ready to ask. Keanu raised the 1,911 again. 3 shots. Pause. 2 more. Every round landed dead center. They didn't punch holes, they traced over the same one. Layer after layer, the paper tore, but never scattered. The silhouette absorbed the shots like it had been waiting for them. And still, he didn't so much as glance toward the recruits. Reggie watched from his peripheral vision, pretending to clean his slide, but his focus was fixed. He couldn't look away now. Not after the tattoo. Not after that grouping. He wanted it to be a trick, a coincidence, a lucky streak from a hobbyist. But the precision told a different story. The more Keanu moved, the clearer it became. Every reload was identical. Every grip reset mirrored the last. He wasn't improvising. He wasn't guessing. He was operating off decades of training, etched into his muscle memory. Petty leaned back against the wall behind lane 6, arms folded, eyes narrowed. "I've trained under guys with 20 years in. They don't shoot like that." Miles stood next to him now, arms crossed. He doesn't even flinch. No reaction to the gun, no overcorrection, nothing. I don't think he blinks, Grant added under his breath. Reggie snapped, but not loudly. So what? Maybe he was. Maybe he did something once. That doesn't mean anything now. He's just some guy who hides in the corner. But even he didn't believe it anymore. There was a weight to what they were seeing. An invisible gravity pulling the group's attention toward Lane 9, no matter how much they tried to act like they didn't care. It wasn't the kind of presence you could fake. There was no bravado in the man's stance, no watch this energy, no hint of ego, just deliberate focus and quiet control. And that was what got under Reggie's skin the most. Control. Not once had Keanu acknowledged them. Not when they laughed. Not when they mocked him. Not even when Petty froze in place after spotting the tattoo. He hadn't offered so much as a glance in their direction. He didn't need to. That absence of reaction said more than any comeback ever could. It said, "You're not worth the noise." Reggie finally raised his weapon again and fired. 5 rounds. Fast. Sharp. One drifted high, one snapped low. The other 3 hit solid, but the grouping wasn't as clean as it should have been, and he knew it. He stepped back and shook out his hands like it didn't matter, but it did. Because, for the first time, Reggie wasn't thinking about his stance. He was thinking about the man in the hoodie, the man who never changed expression, never wasted motion. The man whose old tattoo looked like it had been inked before any of them had even picked up a rifle. Petty said it first, but the others were already thinking it. Who is this guy? Keanu reset his stance. 3 shots. 2. Silence. And now, no one was laughing. Reggie's hands twitched as he set down his Glock. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, jaw clenched, watching the man in Lane 9 move with the same maddening calm. Every step Keanu took was measured, like nothing and no one around him existed. It wasn't just the shooting anymore. It was the control, the refusal to acknowledge them, the way he stripped the air of noise without even trying. Reggie wasn't used to being ignored. In Coronado, he was the one others watched. He was loud, yes, but he backed it up. He could outshoot half the class. He could run longer, climb faster, yell louder, and when someone doubted him, he made sure they didn't do it twice. But here, now, all of that felt small. The more he fired, the more he missed not the target, but the confidence. And that confidence was bleeding into the floor with every perfectly placed shot from the man who hadn't even given them his name. He watched as Keanu holstered the 1911 with a soft click. Then, still calm, he picked up the rag from the bench and wiped down the frame like he'd done it 1,000 times. No rush. No awareness of the 6 sets of eyes locked on him from the other end of the range. Reggie stepped forward. He crossed from lane 5 to lane 8-inch 3 long strides, stopping just short of the red safety line that separated the shooting lane from the walkway. He didn't cross it. Not yet. But he was close enough that Keanu had to hear him. "Hey, old man," Reggie called out, loud enough to echo past the dividing walls. "You ever shoot under pressure?" No reaction. Keanu continued wiping down the slide, slow and even. Petty, who had followed to lane 6, shifted uncomfortably. He didn't say anything. Reggie pressed again, louder this time. "Or do you just sit back there with your antique and hope nobody calls your bluff?" Still nothing. No glance, no raised eyebrow, no smile. Just the same calm pace, same grip, same distance. Reggie took a breath, jaw flexing. Then he spoke again, this time with a tone that carried challenge and something sharper behind it. "How about this?" he said. "You and me, one-on-one. 5 shots, best grouping." Keanu slowly reached into his bag. Reggie's chest lifted slightly as if bracing for a response, but there was no voice. No dramatic acceptance, just movement. Keanu pulled out a clean paper, target no markings, no decals, no grid lines, just a black silhouette. He stepped forward toward the range control panel, punched the distance to 15 yards, and walked the target down himself. Still no words. Reggie watched him go, watched the way his boots hit the concrete in rhythm, watched the way his body moved without a flicker of hesitation. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Keanu reached the target rack, clipped the silhouette onto the hanger, and made a subtle adjustment to center it perfectly. Then he tapped the button and let it roll back down the lane toward the shooting line exactly 15 yards, not an inch more, not an inch less. When he returned to lane 9, he didn't look at Reggie. He didn't nod, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't offer the smallest sign that the challenge meant anything. He simply took his position and began loading a fresh magazine. Slow, intentional. Every round clicked into place with the same quiet finality. Reggie stood behind the red line, feeling every second stretch longer than it should have. The rest of the team had drifted over now, silently gathering behind the dividers, eyes fixed on the two men. No one was laughing anymore. The Bluetooth speaker had been turned off. The staff at the counter had stopped pretending not to watch. Even the other shooters on the far lanes had gone still. Something had changed. It wasn't just about pride now. It wasn't about rank, or age, or experience. It was something unspoken, something that wrapped itself around the silence and squeezed. Reggie couldn't back down now. His reputation depended on it. So he pulled his own target, reset the rack to 15 yards, and stepped into lane 5. He took one breath, then another, lining up his sights like he had 1,000 times before. But the calm wasn't there. His heart was louder than the safety alarm. His thoughts raced faster than the slide of his Glock. He fired 5 shots. 1, pause. 2, another pause. 2 more. The grouping was clean. The last one strayed, just a hair right. Not bad, actually. One of his better clusters of the week. Enough to impress anyone. Maybe even good enough to win. But it didn't feel like enough. Reggie stepped back and looked at the target, hands on his hips. He didn't say a word. He turned to the others, Petty, Miles, Grant, and the rest, and gave a faint nod, trying to mask the tension climbing his throat. He holstered the Glock and waited. Lane 9 was quiet. Keanu stood with the 1,911 resting flat in his hand. His posture never changed. No bounce in the knees, no flex in the shoulders. He lifted the pistol slowly, with that same effortless grace he'd shown since the moment they walked in. He didn't blink, didn't rush, just fired. 5 rounds, steady, each one spaced like it had waited its whole life to be called. And when it was done, the range was silent again. The target didn't flutter. It didn't twist on its wire or shudder with the impact. It just hung there, still, silent, and destroyed. Reggie narrowed his eyes. From his position behind lane 5, he couldn't quite see the detail, but he knew. Everyone knew. There weren't 5 holes. There was only one, dead center. The others leaned forward, peering through the glass and downrange. Petty's mouth opened slightly, his voice stuck somewhere between disbelief and awe. Miles didn't even try to speak. Grant lowered his eyes and gave a low exhale, barely audible over the range fans. Reggie didn't move. Keanu had already stepped back, dropped the magazine, and cleared the chamber with the same unshaken rhythm. He placed the pistol on the bench, picked up the rag, and wiped it down without a single glance toward his opponent. His breathing never changed. No victory grin, no satisfaction, nothing. He hadn't accepted the challenge to prove anything. He had simply answered it. The silence behind him felt like a wall now. Reggie could feel the others standing there, waiting for him to react. His pride burned in his chest, tight and thick, but he couldn't deny what he saw. That wasn't just accuracy. It wasn't skill born from drills or reps. It was deeper, older, earned. He looked at his own target again, 5 rounds, slightly off-center, one drifting just far enough to ruin the symmetry. Normally, he'd have been proud of it. Normally, it would have been enough to dominate the room. But next to what hung in lane 9, it looked like a child's work. Keanu sat down, elbows on his knees, thermos between his hands. The same pose he always returned to, the same quiet ritual. He didn't look at Reggie, didn't need to. The lesson had already been given. The room had already decided. Reggie stared at the floor for a moment, then finally looked up. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There was no comeback, no insult, just the growing realization that something had shifted in him. That moment, the single hole in the center of the silhouette wasn't going away. And neither was the man who had put it there. Keanu took a slow sip from the thermos, eyes focused downrange, like he could see something no one else could. Maybe a memory, maybe something lost long ago. The recruits slowly backed away from the lane, one by one. They weren't retreating from defeat. They were stepping out of the presence of something greater than skill. Something that couldn't be taught in Coronado. Something that demanded silence. Reggie didn't say anything at first. He just exhaled, forced his jaw to unclench, and gave a slight nod to himself. Then he picked up his Glock and stepped back into lane 5 like he was about to walk on stage. His feet moved with purpose, maybe even swagger. Whatever storm had started to stir inside him was now buried under layers of muscle memory and pride. This was still his arena. At least, that's what he told himself. He slammed a fresh magazine into place and racked the slide with a quick, crisp motion. Then he looked down the lane, set his stance, and took a breath. Behind him, the others had gathered closer again. Petty leaned against the side divider, arms crossed, biting his lip. Miles and Grant stood just behind the red line, quiet now, not even pretending to joke. Even the staff behind the glass had stopped wiping counters or organizing the gear rack. All eyes were on lane 5. Reggie squared his shoulders and locked in. He fired 5 shots, not in a panic, not sloppy, but fast, clean, precise. He wanted it to sound confident. He wanted the rhythm of the trigger to send a message. 1. Pause. 2 more. Short pause. Final 2. Then he stepped back and hit the reel switch. The target whirred toward him. The grouping was tight. The shots had all landed in a clean, fist-sized cluster just below the heart line. 4 of the 5 touched edges. 1 was maybe 2 millimeters low, but still inside the main zone. It was good shooting, no question. For a SEAL trainee, even for a seasoned instructor, it would have been enough to win respect on any range. The others nodded. Miles let out a low whistle. "Solid," he said. "Real tight," added Grant. Petty grinned. "Nice. I think the old guys finally got company." Reggie smirked and turned his head just enough to glance toward lane 9. "Bet that scared him off," he muttered. But Keanu wasn't gone. He was already standing. The 1911 was in his hands, and he was walking forward. Keanu didn't speak. He didn't pause. He didn't wait for the room to settle or acknowledge the comments tossed his way. While Reggie's target was still drifting back into place, he stepped into position at lane 9 with the same quiet precision that had defined every movement since he arrived. He inserted a fresh magazine into the 1911. It locked with a soft click. His hands moved with the same fluid rhythm they always had, nothing wasted, nothing extra. He didn't adjust his stance. He didn't reset his footing like he was warming up for a performance. It was already perfect. The room was silent again. Reggie watched, lips pressed tight, arms crossed, eyes locked forward. Keanu raised the pistol, 5 shots. They came exactly the way they always did. 1. Pause. 2. Steady breath. 2 more. Controlled. No rush, no flourish, just inevitability. The sound of his shots echoed differently, not because they were louder, but because they were cleaner. Each one struck with that sharp, cutting precision, like they'd been planned since dawn. No echo trailed. No paper flinched in panic, just impact. When it was over, Keanu didn't move. He didn't step back immediately. He didn't glance at the others. He simply lowered the weapon, slid out the magazine, checked the chamber, and placed the pistol down with the same reverence he had used earlier. Petty blinked first. "Is that 1 hole?" Miles leaned forward, squinting. "No way!" Grant didn't speak at all. He was already stepping toward the viewing glass, trying to see it more clearly. The silhouette on Keanu's target didn't show 5 distinct impacts. It didn't even show a cluster. It showed a single ragged tear centered over the heart zone. The edges were frayed. The paper curled slightly from the friction. Every shot had passed through the exact same place. Reggie stared at it. He didn't step forward. He didn't try to hide his reaction. His arms stayed crossed, but his posture had changed. His weight shifted off his front foot. His shoulders dropped a fraction. And for the first time that morning, he didn't look like a man trying to win. He looked like someone trying to understand. Keanu stepped back from the line and sat down again. No nod, no pride, no performance. He lifted the thermos, took a sip, and stared downrange as if nothing had happened at all. Like it was just another morning. Like it didn't matter. No one spoke. Even the usual background noises of the range. The ricochet of distant shots, the murmur of instructors correcting students, the soft drone of the overhead vents faded into the distance. All attention was locked on lane 9. More specifically, on that silhouette target. One hole, not 5, not even a tight cluster. Just one torn, pulsing shape in the center of the chest zone. It didn't look like someone had shot a firearm. It looked like someone had written a message, and that message was undeniable. Reggie's breath tightened in his chest. His ears rang, not from the gunfire, but from the pressure creeping up behind his eyes. His mind searched for an explanation. Maybe the target was rigged. Maybe the light played tricks on the paper. Maybe the man had used match-grade ammo, something unfair. But no, none of that tracked. The reality was simple. That man, whoever he was, had just erased every ounce of bravado Reggie had carried into the room. He didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to accept the challenge or deliver a speech. That one shot, or rather, those 5 shots, passing through the exact same space, was more than an answer. It was a dismantling. Quiet, absolute, petty, was the first to move. He stepped forward toward the viewing glass, his hands gripping the edge. He stared at the target like it had revealed a secret he wasn't supposed to know. "That's not possible," he whispered. Miles walked up beside him. "That's not luck," he added. "Nobody gets lucky 5 times in the same hole." Grant shook his head slowly. "I've seen Delta guys train. I've seen masterclass competition shooters, and even they don't do that. Not like that." One of the range instructors, who had stepped out from behind the check-in desk, stood near the rear exit, arms crossed, watching. He didn't interrupt, didn't explain. But his expression wasn't one of surprise. He knew. Or at least, he suspected. Back at lane 5, Reggie still hadn't moved. He held his Glock loosely in one hand, the barrel aimed at the floor. It was still warm from the last shot, but it might as well have been cold steel now. He looked down at his own target, the 5-shot cluster he'd been proud of only minutes earlier. It didn't look the same anymore. It looked scattered, unrefined, childish. He lowered his head for just a moment. Not long, just enough to swallow the knot in his throat. Then he turned and looked toward lane 9 again. Keanu was sitting exactly as before, elbows on knees, thermos in hand, eyes forward. He didn't smile, didn't nod. Didn't even blink in Reggie's direction. He just breathed calm and quiet, as if none of this had ever been about proving anything. And maybe that was the worst part. Reggie had made it a challenge. He had turned the range into a proving ground. He had stepped forward like a warrior demanding attention. But the man in lane 9 had refused to meet him there. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. Reggie realized then that the silence wasn't humiliation. It was something else. It was mastery. And he had walked right into it, thinking it was just another sparring match. He stepped back behind the red line, holstered his Glock, and glanced over his shoulder at the others. No one said a word, not even Petty. All of them had felt it, the shift in the air, the weight of something too solid to ignore. Keanu remained seated, still, present, and that single torn hole in the target hung downrange like a reminder that some people don't need to raise their voices to be heard. They just keep shooting, and eventually, everyone listens. Petty stood frozen, his eyes fixed on lane 9. The ragged target still hung there, swaying ever so slightly from the air vents overhead. But Petty wasn't looking at the paper anymore. His gaze was locked on the man sitting just behind it, elbows resting on his knees, thermos cupped loosely in his hands, like the shots he'd just fired meant absolutely nothing. And that's when something shifted in Petty's expression. His brow tightened. His lips parted slightly. but no words came out at first. He just stared. Then, he stepped forward. Not close, just far enough to get a clearer look. The light above Lane 9 flickered for a second, then steadied. And in that moment, he saw it. The profile, the jawline, the eyes. "Guys," he whispered, barely loud enough for the others to hear. Miles turned. "What?" Petty pointed not at the target, but at the man himself. "That's Keanu Reeves." The room didn't erupt. It didn't explode into chatter or disbelief. It just stalled. Reggie chuckled, but there wasn't any real humor in it. "No, it's not." Petty didn't back down. "Look at him." Reggie rolled his eyes. "You're reaching." "No, I'm not. Look, seriously. Forget the hoodie. Look at his face, the jaw, the eyes, even the way he moves. That's him." Miles stepped forward, narrowing his gaze. "I mean, he looks familiar. Yeah, but Keanu Reeves? Here?" Petty nodded slowly. "Not the version from the movies, not the guy on the red carpets. This is older, different, but it's him." Reggie scoffed again. "Right. Keanu Reeves, action star, legendary actor, is just sitting in a corner lane at a rural range in Arizona." Petty didn't smile. "Maybe that's exactly why it makes sense." Reggie hesitated, then glanced back toward Lane 9. Keanu hadn't moved, still seated, still quiet. The thermos now rested between his hands, untouched since the last sip. His face, half shadowed under the edge of the hoodie, was still and unreadable. But Reggie looked harder this time. The angles were sharper now, the lines in his face clearer. His skin had that weathered kind of roughness that didn't come from stage makeup or harsh lighting. It came from time. From where? From life lived somewhere far from the lens. He studied the man's hands, the way they rested, the veins, the scars, the posture. Nothing about him screamed Hollywood. There were no sunglasses, no entourage, no ego, but it was there, quietly. The truth didn't walk into the room. It had been sitting there the entire time. Reggie's smirk faded as he stared longer. He didn't want to admit it, not to himself, not to the others, but the more he looked, the more he couldn't unsee it. The cheekbones, the shape of the eyes, the way his shoulders stayed squared even when sitting. It wasn't just the physicality, it was the energy. Still, centered. Like a man who had carried things too heavy for words. He had seen plenty of people fake that kind of weight. Instructors trying too hard. Veterans with more stories than truth. Guys who wore their titles louder than their actions. But this was different. This wasn't someone performing a role. This was someone who had already walked through the fire and decided not to talk about it. Miles stepped in beside Reggie now, his voice quieter. "You're seeing it too, right?" Reggie didn't answer immediately. Petty kept watching Keanu. "That's not the guy who plays a Navy SEAL," he murmured. Grant echoed from the back. "That's the guy who was one." Keanu shifted ever so slightly on the bench. He hadn't looked their way once, not directly, but somehow it felt like he heard every word. Not through eavesdropping, through presence, through the stillness that absorbs everything around it. The tension in the room had changed again. Not the electric kind that comes before a fight. The reverent kind that comes when something sacred is unfolding. Petty stepped forward, slowly, just to the red line, not crossing it. "Sir," he said, voice tentative. Keanu didn't respond right away. He didn't look startled. He didn't seem offended. He just set his thermos down on the bench beside him and leaned back slightly, spine still straight. The moment stretched. Then his head turned. For the first time that morning, Keanu looked up. Really looked. His eyes met Reggie's, then Petty's, then Miles', one after the other. He didn't scan them. He didn't assess. He just saw them, fully, like he was reading something past their uniforms, past their words. Reggie opened his mouth to speak, but the weight in his chest blocked it. Keanu's gaze held. And then, in a voice that was steady and low, like gravel smoothed over time, he said one word. "I was." Nothing more. Just that. 2 syllables, soft as a whisper, but heavy as an oath. The words didn't hang in the air. They dropped straight into the floor, into their lungs, into the space between all of them. No one moved, no one needed to, because now the question was answered. And none of them would ever forget how. The silence after that single word wasn't awkward, it was sacred. I was. It wasn't a boast, it wasn't a challenge, it wasn't even a confession. It was a release. And it was enough to peel the air clean of every assumption that had floated in the room since the recruits had first walked through the door. The same men who had laughed, who had flexed, who had joked about a stranger in a hoodie, were now standing motionless in the presence of something real. Reggie felt his throat tighten. He didn't know what to say. He wasn't even sure he was supposed to say anything. That one word had pulled back a curtain none of them had realized was there, and behind it wasn't a myth. It was a man older, quieter, and carved out of something time itself had stopped trying to weather. Miles took a half step forward, like he wanted to ask a question but didn't know if he had the right. Grant's eyes were still locked on Keanu's face, as if he was memorizing every detail for later. Petty stood completely still, arms slack by his sides. Keanu turned his gaze back downrange, not in dismissal, just in rhythm, like he had answered what needed answering, and that was enough. Reggie finally cleared his throat. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, voice rougher than he intended. Keanu didn't turn. He spoke softly. "Because silence outlives applause." No one replied. Because there was nothing to say. The words landed like scripture. Heavy, simple, true. Reggie shifted, trying to steady himself. The man in front of him wasn't playing a character. He wasn't performing. This wasn't a scene in a movie or a training exercise. This was something older than all of that. Something that had grown in the shadows of years and decisions too heavy to share. It explained everything. The perfect rhythm, the unshakable stillness, the scarred trident inked into his arm, the way he didn't flinch under fire or fold under mockery. The man who had just outshot them all hadn't come here to prove a point. He'd come here to remember who he once was, and maybe who he could still be. Petty finally broke the stillness. "You're really him," he said, barely more than a breath. "You're Keanu Reeves." Keanu turned slightly, just enough that they could see the faintest trace of a smile in the corner of his mouth. Not wide, not dramatic, just the kind that happens when a truth doesn't need to be defended anymore. "I used to be," he said quietly. And just like that, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't about distance. It was about respect. And the recruits, who had come in full of energy and noise, now stood like students outside a closed book they didn't know how to open. But they wanted to. Because for the first time, they realized the story wasn't fiction. It was history. And it was. Sitting on lane 9, drinking from a dented thermos, watching the paper downrange as if it still had something left to teach. The room didn't return to normal. Whatever normal had been that morning, swagger, jokes, casual competition, it was gone now. The recruits didn't say it aloud, but each of them knew. They had crossed an invisible line, not through confrontation, but through revelation. And now they were standing in the quiet shadow of a man who had nothing left to prove. Keanu didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stood once more at lane 9, inserted a fresh magazine into the 1911, and resumed the rhythm. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause, reset. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even especially fast. But it was flawless. The trigger never jerked. The muzzle never twitched. Every movement was deliberate, as if his body already knew the outcome before he even lifted the weapon. And now, the recruits weren't mocking. They weren't comparing gear or challenging each other. They were watching. Petty stood at the edge of lane 6, his arms no longer crossed. His hands were down, fingers loose, as if afraid to move and break the moment. Miles leaned against the divider, face unreadable. Grant had stopped adjusting his holster altogether. Even Reggie, still near the center lanes, hadn't touched his Glock in minutes. They watched, not just because the shooting was perfect, but because of what wasn't there. No celebration, no pride, No need for validation. It was the silence that taught. With each shot, Keanu carved out something deeper than skill. He carved discipline, precision, presence. They weren't watching a man perform, they were watching a man be. Every recruit in the room had spent years chasing that kind of control. Through drills, through reps, through yelling instructors and broken sleep and freezing dawn runs. But what they were seeing now couldn't be explained in metrics. It couldn't be scored on a whiteboard or corrected with a range report. This was something else. Something they hadn't been taught in Coronado. Something that made them all just listen. Across the room, one of the instructors, Master Chief Walters, paused mid-sentence as he corrected a student's stance. His eyes drifted toward the far corner. He'd noticed it too. The rhythm, the presence, the shift in atmosphere. He didn't interrupt, didn't walk over, just watched. Because even a man like Walters knew when someone else had stepped into the room carrying more than a firearm. Keanu fired 3 more rounds. Pause. 2 more. Reset. Still, no one spoke. And in that silence, something deeper than words began to settle. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of meaning. Full of questions that didn't need to be asked. Full of a respect that had quietly replaced the bravado from earlier. Each of the recruits stood in that silence like they were learning how to breathe all over again. Keanu continued. 3 shots. Clean. 2 shots. Cleaner. His stance never shifted. His breathing never changed. It was like watching meditation through movement, a ritual so well practiced it no longer looked like effort. And the more the recruits watched, the more they felt it not just in their eyes, but in their posture, their thoughts, their pride. Miles was the first to step back into his lane, but he didn't rush. He didn't try to copy Keanu's rhythm. He just stared down range for a long moment before picking up his weapon. His hands felt clumsier now, heavier somehow. He fired a single shot. It hit the paper, slightly high, slightly left. He paused, looked back at lane 9. Keanu was already reloading. Smooth, no wasted motion, no tension in the hands. It wasn't just about hitting the center, it was about how he moved. That was the part none of them could stop watching. That was the part they couldn't imitate. Grant followed Miles, stepping back into lane 4, but instead of immediately firing, he just stood there, grip set, eyes forward, trying to slow his breath, trying to find whatever that stillness was that Keanu carried. Petty moved the slowest. He didn't pick up his firearm. He didn't move toward his lane. He just watched. Every reload, every trigger press, every controlled exhale. Petty absorbed it the way someone watches waves hitting the shore. Repetitive, yes, but never exactly the same. Reggie hadn't moved. His arms were folded again, but there was no confidence in it now. He stared at lane 9 like it was a mirror reflecting something uncomfortable. His jaw was tight, his shoulders hunched slightly. He was still watching, but this time, it wasn't to judge, it was to understand. Across the room, Master Chief Walters finally spoke to the student beside him, but even his voice had changed. It was softer, less mechanical. Even the instructors were watching lane 9 now more than their own students. Keanu hadn't addressed them once. He hadn't offered a tip, a correction, a gesture of instruction. But somehow he was teaching. Without saying a word, he had drawn in a room full of warriors and made them quiet, not with force, with presence. And every shot he fired was a lesson none of them had expected to learn. Keanu finished another 5-shot sequence, each round folding into the same space on the target like a thread pulled through a needle. He stepped back again, calmly ejecting the magazine and clearing the chamber, his movements as natural as brushing dust off a sleeve. Then he sat down, same posture, same expression, same steady breath, and lifted his thermos for another sip. But no one looked away. Not one of the 6 recruits moved until he'd placed the thermos back on the bench. It wasn't fear, it wasn't awe, it was something different. It was the kind of attention usually reserved for someone who had done the things others only trained for. Petty turned toward the others. His voice was quiet, but clear. "You realize we've been talking this whole time like we had it figured out?" No one answered him. but he wasn't really asking. Reggie shifted his stance, arms dropping to his sides. "That's what real looks like," he said under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Miles stepped closer to lane 6, then paused just outside. He never once corrected us, never even looked like he cared we were here. "He didn't need to," Grant said. They all stood there, the same group that had stormed into the building, laughing, stomping, joking about YouTubers and old-school grips. And now they were barely speaking, as if afraid their voices would break something delicate. The targets down their lanes still hung. Half-finished drills, forgotten plans. None of it seemed important anymore. They'd come to test themselves. Instead, they were being tested in a way they hadn't prepared for. Keanu picked up a clean cloth and gently wiped down the slide of his pistol again. The movement wasn't necessary, there was no sweat, no grime, but he did it anyway. Like it was part of a ritual, part of a discipline that extended far beyond firing a weapon. It was respect for the tool, for the task, for the silence. A new shot rang out suddenly from lane 3. Petty had finally fired. The round hit, solid and clean, but slightly left. He didn't curse. He didn't shake his head. He simply reset his grip, adjusted his stance, and fired again, this time slower. More mindful. 3 shots. Pause. 2. Pause. No one told him to do it that way. He just absorbed it. From the man who never once raised his voice. Miles followed. Then Grant, each of them adjusting something small. Their breath, their grip, their focus. Not trying to copy Keanu, but trying to carry a piece of what they'd seen. Not the speed, not the precision, the intention. Even the way they moved between reloads had changed, slower, more deliberate, less noise, less bounce. Back at lane 9, Keanu looked downrange, his eyes locked on the same ragged center hole he'd been punching through all morning. The range had dozens of shooters that day, but only one lane had gone completely silent before it made everyone else quiet. He didn't offer advice. He didn't explain his technique. He didn't ask for attention. And yet, every instructor, every recruit, every casual shooter who glanced his way couldn't help but notice the same thing. He wasn't there to teach, but he was teaching anyway, not with words, with silence. And with every breath, every step, every shot, he reminded them what real mastery looks like. Not loud, not boastful, just present, constant, and completely undeniable. Reggie lingered longer than the others. The others had started to drift back toward their own lanes, occasionally firing a few slow rounds, still affected by the weight of what they'd just seen. But Reggie remained where he stood, arms loose by his sides, fingers slightly curled around the edge of his belt. His pride wasn't just bruised, it was unraveling. He didn't know why it bothered him so much. It wasn't like he hadn't lost before. During BUD/S, during drills, during time trials, he'd come up short. He'd fallen, gotten yelled at, corrected. But that was different. That was part of the game, part of learning. There was a coach, a structure, an explanation. But this wasn't training. This was something no one had prepared him for. He kept his eyes locked on lane 9. Keanu stood again. He moved the same way he had all morning. Quiet, practiced, almost ritualistic. The pistol moved in his hands like it belonged there, like it was born with him. There was no rush, no fatigue, no variance. He moved with the same control, now hours in as he had during his first string. 3 shots, pause, 2, the same hole, still. Reggie exhaled slowly. He didn't know how the man was doing it. He'd seen elite shooters before. Navy marksmen, Delta Force guests, FBI SWAT demos. Some of them were fast, some were surgical, but none of them had this unshakable calm, this almost sacred rhythm. The man in the hoodie wasn't showing off. He was remembering. Behind Reggie, Petty was quietly tapping on his phone, brows drawn close together, scrolling slower than usual. Miles noticed. "What are you doing?" Petty didn't answer right away. His thumb froze mid-scroll, eyes scanning something on the screen. Then he turned the phone toward Miles. Miles leaned in, read the headline, and froze. Grant caught the shift in their faces and stepped closer. "What is it?" Petty's voice was soft, like he didn't want Keanu to hear, even though they were well out of range. "I think I found him." Reggie turned slowly. Petty tilted the phone. There it was. An old Article 15, maybe 20 years old. The photo was grainy. Keanu, standing next to a line of fellow operators, all in tan uniforms, dust-stained and sun-creased. His hair was shorter, his face younger, but the posture was identical. Head slightly bowed, shoulders square, elbows tight to the body. Even then, he wasn't at the center of the photo. He stood just slightly off to the side, but the title made it clear. Former Navy SEAL turned actor, Keanu Reeves quietly returns to civilian life. Miles blinked. "Wait, he was." Petty nodded. "It wasn't public, at least not in the early days. He kept it quiet. Rumors floated around Hollywood, but he never talked about it. Said it wasn't relevant to the roles. Said he didn't want to glamorize anything." Grant leaned closer. "That's why he disappears between films. He's not dodging the spotlight. He's avoiding it," Petty said. Reggie stepped forward and took the phone from Petty. He stared at the image, at the old version of the same man now standing 30 feet away. It was him. All of it was true. Reggie stared at the photo like it had been waiting for him to find it. He zoomed in. The image pixelated slightly, but it didn't matter. The jawline, the eyes, the quiet strength in his posture. It was all there, just younger, a little less weathered, but unmistakably the same man sitting in lane 9 right now, pressing forward on a pistol slide with the ease of someone making morning coffee. And now it all made sense. The silence, the precision, the trident tattoo, faded and scarred like it had seen the same things its bearer had seen. The refusal to react, to defend, to engage in ego games. Keanu had been a SEAL long before he became a movie star. He'd lived the role others only studied for screen. He wasn't acting like a warrior. He was simply being who he'd already been. Reggie handed the phone back to Petty, but didn't look at anyone else. His eyes were fixed on Keanu again, who was now standing mid-lane, checking his target. Same stance, same control. 3 shots. 2, reset. Reggie felt something break inside him. Not loudly, not all at once, but something that had been holding him upright for years. An illusion, maybe. A belief that confidence came from the volume of your voice, the speed of your movements, the visible trophies of achievement. But this man had stripped all of that away and replaced it with something quieter, something deeper. Keanu wasn't there to teach, and yet Reggie had never learned so much in so little time. He took a slow step back from the red line and turned toward the others. They were still standing in a tight cluster behind him, Petty gripping his phone, Miles chewing the inside of his cheek, Grant's arms crossed in front of his chest. None of them looked like the cocky group that had swaggered in earlier. They looked different now, focused, thoughtful, like they were reevaluating more than just the man in lane 9. Reggie lowered his voice. "You think he comes here every week?" Petty nodded. "According to the range guy at the front, yeah. Same time, same lane, every Monday." Miles added, "I bet no one's ever talked to him." "Not really. No one dared to," Grant said. Reggie looked back at lane 9. Keanu had just finished his final set. He ejected the magazine, checked the chamber, then placed the pistol gently onto the rag as if it were something alive. There was no flourish, no sense of ending. He moved like someone who didn't need closure, just rhythm. He sat back down and lifted the thermos. Reggie watched his hand. It didn't shake. Nothing about him ever did. Petty stepped forward again, slowly. "Should we say something?" "No," Reggie replied. "Not out of fear, out of respect." Because the truth was, there was nothing they could say that would add to what they'd already heard. He had spoken one word, and it was more powerful than any speech they could give. So they watched in silence as Keanu Reeves, former SEAL, actor, ghost in plain sight, took one last sip from his thermos, rose from the bench, and walked calmly down the range to retrieve his target. Still silent, still steady, still teaching. Monday came again. But the air felt different this time. Long before the sun had pushed over the red Arizona hills, long before the buzz of the security door echoed through the concrete corridors of the range, people were already waiting. Not crowding, not talking, just waiting, quietly. No one had announced it. There hadn't been a post, a flyer, a conversation with certainty. But word had spread. Something had happened the week before. A shift, a presence, a lesson without language. And now, without fanfare, more than a dozen people had shown up before 6:30 a.m. Some were regulars, seasoned shooters who normally occupied lanes 1 through 4 like clockwork. Others were new, younger, curious. They came alone or in pairs, but they all walked the same way. Slow, respectful, no Bluetooth speakers in their pockets, no loud laughter in the lobby, and Lane 9, untouched. There were open lanes closer to the door, easier to access, better lit, but no one even approached the corner lane. The light still flickered faintly overhead, but now that dimness wasn't a problem, it was a boundary. It was his. The staff noticed too. The young guy at the front desk, who had worked weekends for almost a year, stood straighter as he organized the logbook. The manager who normally checked invoices at opening had stepped out front, coffee in hand, eyes scanning the parking lot like he already knew who was about to walk in. And at 6:45 a.m., exactly, the door buzzed. Keanu walked in. Same gray hoodie, same faded jeans, same battered thermos clipped to his pack. No sunglasses, no expression. He moved to the counter without hesitation, signed the logbook the same way he always did Kay Donovan, and paid in cash, just like before. But this time, when he finished writing, the guy behind the desk didn't just nod. He stood still for a second, then offered a quiet morning. Keanu gave the smallest nod in return, then walked toward lane 9. No one stopped him. No one tried to say more. They knew better. And Reggie, he was already there. He'd arrived at 6:20 long before Keanu. No gloves, no bravado. Just a quiet stance near the far wall, close enough to see lane 9, far enough not to intrude. He didn't bring anyone with him. Didn't say a word. He just watched. When Keanu entered the lane, Reggie gave a small nod. Keanu didn't return it, but he didn't need to. He placed his bag down in the exact same spot, laid out the same tools in the same order: pistol case, ammo, thermos, cloth, and Saturday Reggie watched every move, not to challenge, to understand, to learn, because something had changed in him too. And this time, he came to listen, not with questions, but with silence. Keanu sat in the plastic chair, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped in front of him, eyes locked downrange. The paper target wasn't even up yet. The range hadn't opened for live fire. But still, he stared ahead like he was already there, like the world in front of him was the only one that mattered. Reggie remained behind the red line. He didn't fidget. He didn't pace. He stood still, arms folded not in defiance, but in focus. Watching. Memorizing. It wasn't about the gun. Not really. Reggie had trained with every kind of weapon system known to modern warfare. He knew mechanics, recoil, trigger pull. He had passed qualifications. He had excelled. But none of that gave him what Keanu carried so effortlessly: this invisible weight of earned calm, this discipline forged in silence. More people arrived now, trickling in quietly. Lane assignments were made with fewer words. The regulars nodded at each other instead of chatting. The instructors didn't bark like usual. They walked slower, glanced toward the back corner more often than usual, and corrected students with a tone that bordered on whisper. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew Lane 9 had changed. The range officer flipped the master switch, and the red light above the range doors flickered green. Keanu stood. He loaded 5 rounds into his 1911 with that same careful motion. No sound except the soft clicks of steel sliding into place. Then he stepped forward. 3 shots. Pause. 2 more. They landed center. Reggie didn't flinch. He didn't shake his head like he might have last week. He simply exhaled, softly, and took a step back 1 pace, hands loose at his sides. He wasn't there to compete anymore. He was there to learn a different kind of sharpness. Petty arrived a few minutes later, holding a range bag that suddenly looked too polished in contrast to the man at the end of the building. He spotted Reggie standing alone and approached him slowly. "He's here," Petty said, barely above a whisper. Reggie nodded. "Anyone talk to him?" Reggie shook his head. "Not today." Petty lowered his voice even further. "He know we're watching?" Reggie's answer was immediate. "Yeah." He didn't say it like a guess. He said it like a fact. Keanu kept shooting. 5 shots. Slow. Measured. Every single one landed within the same space. Again. Behind them, a staff member quietly wiped the counter where Keanu had signed in. He didn't replace the pen. He just let it sit there, untouched. And then Reggie saw it. On the partition beside Lane 9, just above the wooden ledge where shooters rest their elbows, a new brass plaque had been installed. Small, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But Reggie looked. It read, "Reserved until he says otherwise." No name, no rank, no title, just space, just reverence. Petty saw it too. He didn't speak, he didn't even blink. Because the message was clear. Lane 9 didn't belong to a man. It belonged to a moment, to a memory, to the lesson that man kept teaching every time he picked up that pistol and said nothing. And Reggie knew now, it wasn't just about how he shot. It was about how he carried himself when no one was clapping, and especially when no one needed to. The thunder of Keanu's second magazine echoed a little longer than usual. Not because it was louder, but because the silence afterward felt heavier. Everyone had paused. Even the newer recruits who hadn't been there the previous week felt it. Something was different about the way the air moved around Lane 9. Keanu stepped back, pressed the mag release, and let the empty magazine drop smoothly into his palm. He slid it into the pouch on his belt without looking down. His hands moved like they'd done this thousands of times before. Because they had. That's when Reggie moved. It was quiet, deliberate, no showmanship, no clapping or words to break the rhythm. He walked with steady steps, holding a small cardboard box with both hands. It was sealed with clear tape, still fresh from the store shelf. On the side, bold black letters read, .45 ACP, 50 rounds. Reggie didn't speak at first. He stood at the red line, just before the firing area, and waited until Keanu noticed him. Keanu turned slightly. His eyes, calm and unreadable, settled on Reggie's face. Reggie didn't shift under the gaze this time. He extended the box outward, arms level. Then he spoke, with a tone stripped clean of ego. Figured 30 wasn't enough. Keanu looked down at the box for a moment, then back up at Reggie. He didn't smile, didn't nod with approval or pretend to be touched, but he reached out, took the box, and gave a single nod. That was enough. Reggie backed away slowly, not turning his back, not rushing the moment. He returned to the wall where Petty was leaning, slid his hands into his pockets, and stood there silently. Petty raised his eyebrows slightly, but didn't say a word. Reggie didn't offer one either. He just watched. Keanu sliced the tape with his thumb, opened the lid, and methodically began loading rounds into a fresh magazine. His fingers moved with smooth precision. No rush, no hesitation. The air in the range had changed again. The offering wasn't just about bullets. It was about respect. Reggie had given something that couldn't be bought with money or charm. He had acknowledged mastery without demanding a lesson, without asking for a thing in return. And Keanu had accepted it not with gratitude, but with understanding. That kind of quiet exchange said more than 1,000 compliments. Others at the range noticed. A few of the regulars shifted where they stood. A middle-aged woman paused her draw drills at lane 3. One of the instructors, leaning near the back wall, tilted his head with a look of quiet curiosity. Keanu returned to his position. Loaded the new mag. 5 shots, 1 hole. He switched stances. 5 more. Identical placement. There was no commentary, no praise, no applause. But in the space between each shot, Something unspoken passed through every pair of eyes watching. The next to notice was an older man with a salt and pepper beard, stationed 2 lanes over. He nudged the young man beside him, pointed subtly toward Keanu, and whispered something behind his hearing protection. The young man didn't respond, he just watched. By the time Keanu finished the box Reggie had offered, there were no distractions left in the building. No phones out, no idle jokes. Every recruit, instructor, and weekend enthusiast had slowly adjusted their rhythm to his. His silence had become a presence that changed the space around him. Reggie stayed rooted to the wall, hands still in his pockets, not speaking. But you could see it, his jaw had softened, the usual smug edge, replaced by something else. Not shame, not even awe. It was clarity. Petty shifted beside him. "You think he knows?" he asked under his breath. Reggie kept his eyes on lane 9. "He knew the second I stepped forward," he said. "He just didn't need to say it." At lane 5, a man tried a fast double tap and flinched at the noise of his own shots. His grouping was off. He looked down, adjusted his grip, but his focus drifted back. To lane 9. Keanu reloaded again, this time from his own stash. He moved like a machine, made human by grief and time. The way his shoulders moved, the patience in his trigger discipline, it all told a story none of them had read, but all of them felt. Reggie finally stepped away from the wall. He didn't move toward Keanu this time. He walked to lane 7 and picked up his own Glock. The gloves stayed off. He didn't check his phone. He didn't glance around for validation. He loaded slowly, took his stance. He fired 1 round, then stopped. The shot had landed low, a couple inches off center. He let out a slow breath. Petty called from the wall. "Try again." Reggie did. This time it landed just shy of the center ring. Still no celebration. Still no cursing. He reloaded and kept going, silent. Lane 7 had never felt so quiet. And not because of shame, but because of respect. The same kind of respect Keanu had shown them all by not saying a single word. Back at lane 9, Keanu finished his last 5 shots. The hole in the target hadn't grown wider, it had just deepened. The paper tore slightly at the edges, but the rounds all punched through the same point. Then, for the first time since Monday, he stepped back from the firing line. He looked at the target, expression unreadable. Then he calmly pressed the button to bring it forward. When the paper reached him, he pulled it down, folded it once, then turned and walked past the other lanes. Reggie turned just slightly as Keanu passed him. Keanu didn't stop, but as he passed Reggie's shoulder, he said 2 quiet words. "Nice box." It wasn't sarcastic, it wasn't patronizing, it was acknowledgement. And Reggie nodded once, eyes forward, lips pressing together to suppress something that wasn't quite a smile but close. Keanu walked out of the range without a glance behind him. And for the first time since this group of recruits started training, they all understood something together. The loudest teacher was silence, and the highest praise was a nod from a man who didn't owe you anything. Monday faded into Thursday before anyone noticed the change wasn't temporary. The recruits stopped checking the clock before drills. They stopped glancing sideways for jokes or validation. There were no viral TikToks filmed that week, no grainy snapshots of Keanu walking past lane 9. The quiet had settled in like a fog, and somehow, that silence taught more than 1,000 instructors ever could. Even the range officers noticed. By Thursday morning, the range filled earlier than usual, not from obligation, but from something different, curiosity mixed with reverence. Lane 9 stayed open, untouched, as if some invisible rule had been written in the air itself. Keanu arrived, same time as always, 6:45 a.m. sharp. He walked in wearing the same faded gray jacket and worn black boots. Nothing flashy, nothing that shouted celebrity. If anything, he looked more like a retired contractor than the star of action films. But none of that mattered now. Not to the people who had been watching. Not after what they'd seen. When he stepped into lane 9 and set his box down, the air in the room shifted. No one said a word. He didn't nod at anyone. No greeting, no flex, no flourish. He loaded his first magazine in silence, racked the slide, and stepped into position. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, reset. The pattern repeated like a heartbeat. Clean, precise, controlled. Everyone else had started to mimic it, without even realizing. Petty was at lane 4 now, and instead of cracking jokes or trying to show off his grip, he had adjusted his stance. Shoulders relaxed, elbows tucked. He fired in clusters, not bursts. Lane 6 was occupied by Marquez, one of the more outspoken recruits who'd often come late and distracted. Now, she was already deep into her warm-up rounds, copying the 3-2 rhythm exactly. Even Reggie, usually defiant, usually loud, had been quiet since Tuesday. He came in early, loaded slow, fired slower. No gloves, no music, no banter. Reggie watched Keanu, not with jealousy, but with awareness. Every movement from lane 9 taught him something, not about shooting, but about stillness, about presence, about how much power a person could hold without ever speaking. Keanu fired again. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, reset. Someone whispered from the back of the room, but it was quickly silenced by a look from one of the instructors. No one wanted to break the rhythm. It had become sacred. Even the range officers, tough, grizzled men with years of military training, stopped mid-conversation to watch lane 9 when the shooting started. Keanu's body language never changed. There were no extra movements, no wasted effort. He moved like someone who had lived inside repetition for so long it had become prayer. It wasn't about performance. It wasn't about showing off. It was about honoring something, someone, maybe that lived in every breath he took behind that line. And the recruits? They felt it. Some of them didn't know why the silence made them nervous at first. But by Thursday, they didn't want it to end. By Friday morning, even the newer recruits who hadn't seen the first day were following suit. They were told stories in whispers, not shouts, about the man in lane 9, about what he used to be, but more importantly, about how he moved, about the silence that followed him. There were no printed out flyers, no emails, no protocol updates, but somehow the lesson had spread like fire through dry grass. Don't speak when he's shooting, don't crowd lane 9, don't ask for selfies, watch, learn, absorb. Instructors who used to yell corrections now lowered their voices. They started using softer commands. They watched the impact ripple out from lane 9 like invisible waves, touching each young shooter without needing to explain anything. Keanu never said a word. Even during breaks, when others wiped sweat and cracked their backs and traded tips, he simply sat near his box, reloading with methodical calm. A nod here, a glance there, but never attention-seeking, never disruptive. He wasn't there to prove anything anymore, and that made him the loudest voice in the room. By mid-morning, lane 7 shooter jammed their sidearm. It clanked in frustration. Normally, that would have drawn laughs or sarcastic applause. This time, silence. Keanu didn't even look over. He simply kept going. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, reset. The girl in lane 7 cleared the jam and reset her posture. She breathed deep, steadied her hands, and matched his rhythm. No one instructed her to. She just knew. It felt right. Petty, from lane 4, took longer between magazines now. Not because he was slow, but because he wanted each round to mean something. He watched Keanu's breathing, matched it when he could, and something unexpected began to form between the recruits. Not just respect for Keanu, but for each other. The silence fostered discipline. The discipline became shared. The shared rhythm became culture. At the end of the session, one of the instructors, a barrel-chested man named Foreman, called a halt. But even he spoke softer than usual. Unload and make safe. No one clapped. No one celebrated. They all just looked toward lane 9, where Keanu stood quietly collecting his brass. Then came something no one expected. Reggie approached lane 9 again, this time slower than before. He didn't bring ammo, didn't try to shake hands. He just said 2 words, "Thank you." Keanu looked up, nodded once. That was all. But somehow, it meant everything. Later that afternoon, the staff reviewed security footage, partly out of habit, partly out of curiosity. The director of the facility paused the video at 1 frame. All 10 recruits, standing straight, spaced out across their lanes. No slouching, no laughing, every shot measured. And at the far right, lane 9, the man with the gray jacket and still eyes. Alone, but not isolated. Keanu Reeves didn't teach with lectures. He didn't command the crows room with his past. He led with his presence. And the silence he created, it had done more in 5 days than most instructors managed in a year. It had taught them how to carry themselves. It had reminded them that excellence doesn't need noise, that legacy doesn't come from ego. It comes from quiet example, from earned respect, from presence. And that's why, the following Monday, Lane 9 would still be waiting, empty, untouched, for the man who never asked for reverence, but earned it without ever speaking. It was quiet after the range cleared out that afternoon. Most of the recruits had drifted off to their lockers, joking in hushed tones, still carrying the discipline from the morning. Even Petty had stopped narrating everything under his breath. A kind of respect had taken hold, like a film settling over everything they touched. Keanu stayed back, as usual. He crouched near his lane, collecting the last of his brass, his movements deliberate. The others had learned not to interrupt that moment. It was like a ceremony now watching him finish his session. But this time, Reggie didn't leave. He lingered by the bench outside the range door, his gloves hanging loosely from one hand, a bottle of water untouched in the other. He looked different now. Not just quieter, but more grounded. Less of the showman, more of the soldier. His jokes had faded into something deeper, thoughtful. Keanu walked past him, not expecting conversation. But Reggie stood. "Hey," he said. "Mind if I sit?" Keanu didn't answer. He just sat down first. That was answer enough. Reggie eased into the bench beside him, careful not to crowd. The sun hung low behind the facility, throwing long shadows across the training grounds. The air was still. Everything around them seemed to pause. They sat in silence for a full minute. Then Reggie cleared his throat. "You ever think about teaching for real?" Keanu didn't look at him right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the gravel in front of them, watching dust drift between his boots. "I spent years," he said slowly, "trying to forget what I'd teach." Reggie didn't respond. Not yet. Keanu finally glanced over. "Some things you don't want to pass on." Reggie nodded like he understood, though a part of him was still trying to. "But I think I get it," he said quietly. "You're still passing it on, whether you mean to or not." Another pause, another silence that didn't feel awkward. Keanu leaned forward, resting his mallet, elbows on his knees. "I guess some things you don't teach by speaking. Some things you just absorb." Reggie nodded again, slower this time, like it settled in deeper. "I didn't get it before," he said. "When you first showed up, I thought you were just trying to prove something." "I'm not," Keanu said flatly. "I know. Now I do." Reggie looked away for a moment. "You don't have to talk to get people to listen. That's new for me." Keanu cracked a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Loudness is easy," he said. "Silence costs more." Reggie stared out toward the range. "You ever think about what you left behind?" Keanu's jaw tightened slightly. "All the time. But you don't talk about it." "I don't need to." Reggie sat back. "I think I used to laugh at guys like that. Thought they were holding on to some broken pride." "Sometimes it's not pride," Keanu said. "Sometimes it's survival." Reggie didn't reply for a while. Just sat in that. The wind picked up slightly, rustling a paper cup across the pavement. Neither of them moved to stop it. "You know," Reggie finally said, "when I first got here, I figured I was going to own this place." Keanu didn't look at him, just waited. Reggie let out a soft, self-deprecating chuckle. "All the swagger, all the noise. I thought it meant something." Keanu didn't laugh. "It meant you were scared," he said gently. Reggie blinked. Keanu turned toward him now. "Noise is a cover. We all use it. Doesn't mean we're weak, just means we don't want anyone to see where we're soft." That hit. Not harsh, just true. Reggie rubbed the back of his neck. "You don't talk much," he said. "But when you do," Keanu shook his head slightly. "Even silence teaches, if you let it." Reggie looked down at the gravel between his boots. The same ground Keanu had been staring at earlier. It looked different now, like it held stories he hadn't earned yet. He didn't speak for a while after that. The silence between them deepened, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was full. The hum of a distant HVAC unit filled the space where words could have gone, but neither man reached for them. Reggie stayed seated, still processing, still learning. Keanu reached into his range bag and pulled out a cloth, slowly wiping down one of his pistols. The motion was calm, repetitive, grounded. Reggie finally spoke again. "You ever think about what it meant to the people you served with?" Keanu stopped for just a second. "I try not to, but they probably still remember you. Guys like that don't forget." Keanu set the pistol down gently. "I didn't do anything special. I did my job. That's it." "That's the part I don't get," Reggie admitted. "You don't act like it meant anything, but the way you carry it, it's like it's still with you." Keanu nodded. "Because at Island," Reggie looked over. "You think that's why you're here? At this range?" Keanu thought about it. "I think I come here because it's the only place where things make sense. You line up, you breathe, you focus, you do your part." Reggie exhaled slowly. "It's strange. I used to think I needed attention. I wanted the laughs, the claps, the Instagram clips, all of it. And now?" Keanu asked. Reggie paused. "Now I want to be someone worth listening to, even if I'm not talking." Keanu nodded once. "That's the harder path." They sat again in silence, but it felt different now, more like rest than avoidance. Reggie leaned forward. "I don't know what I want out of this program anymore. I thought it was just another stepping stone." "It can still be that," Keanu said. "But what matters is who you are when you get to the next step." Reggie looked over, eyes a little softer. "You'd make a hell of an instructor." "I'm not here to teach," Keanu said. "Here to remember." Reggie didn't push after that. He just sat with the words, let them settle in. The sun had shifted by then. Shadows had shortened. The world had moved on around them. But Reggie hadn't. Not completely. And that, maybe, was the beginning of something. He stood first this time. But not out of impatience. Out of respect. It happened quietly, on a Monday morning like any other. The sun had only just begun to filter through the eastern windows of the range when the first recruit arrived. Petty. She liked getting there early now. Something about the stillness of the place before the drills began helped her focus. She had her gear slung over her shoulder and a protein bar in hand when she saw it. Above lane 9, fixed just above the lane number, was a small brass plaque. No fanfare, no signature, no seal, just a simple engraving, barely larger than a nameplate. "Reserved until he says otherwise." She stood there for a moment, unsure if it was real. Her gaze narrowed. No name, no initials, no title, just 7 words. And yet, the meaning was unmistakable. She looked around. The range staff were already inside, sipping coffee, chatting softly by the front desk. But nobody pointed it out. Nobody joked. It was like it had always been there. Like the range itself had simply acknowledged a truth and decided to honor it in the only language it knew: precision and permanence. One by one, the others arrived. Jackson, Morales, Reggie. They noticed it too. Each of them paused, looked, absorbed, but no one touched it. No one dared take a photo. Even Reggie, who had once lived for the camera, didn't reach for his phone. He just stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the plaque, a strange kind of pride mixed with reverence etched across his face. It wasn't about fandom. It wasn't about celebrity anymore. It was about what they'd seen, what they now understood. Lane 9 had become something more than just a stretch of concrete and cardboard targets. It was a classroom, a shrine, a sacred place where skill, humility, and legacy met in quiet rhythm and steel. Keanu arrived exactly at 6:45 a.m., as he always did. Same plain hoodie, same steel case, same silence. He didn't look at the plaque right away. He walked past the other lanes, offered a quiet nod to the staff, and set down his bag. Only when he unzipped it and began laying out his gear did he finally look up. He saw it. His eyes rested on it for 3 heartbeats. Then he simply nodded once and kept setting up. Nothing more was said. But everyone in the room saw it. And that was enough. Reggie stayed near lane 7 that day. Not shooting, just watching. He noticed something subtle in how the room behaved. Ever since the plaque went up, lane 9 had changed. It wasn't just about Keanu anymore. It was about the air surrounding that space. A current of quiet respect flowed through the range. When Keanu stepped up to shoot, no one else moved. No one dared fire over him. His first magazine clicked into place with the same smooth precision they'd all come to expect. But now, there was an added gravity. His presence didn't just command attention, it reshaped the atmosphere. The cadence of his shots seemed to measure the beat of the room. Every trigger pull was a reminder not of violence, but of mastery. And every pause, every breath, was a lesson in control. After his third round, when the brass clinked softly onto the floor, Morales whispered, "It's like a sermon." No one answered, but the silence was agreement enough. Petty, who had always been the most vocal during drills, didn't say a word. Her eyes followed every motion. Her stance mimicked his from a distance. Jackson adjusted his posture without realizing he was doing it. Even the range officers had taken to standing straighter when Keanu was there, and no one dared occupy lane 9 when he wasn't. That was the part that surprised even the staff. Days when Keanu didn't show, whether for travel or other commitments, lane 9 remained untouched. Recruits filled the other lanes first, sometimes even crowded into a single one rather than break the silent pack that had formed. One officer tried, once, to offer it to a latecomer in a rush. "Lane 9's open," he had said casually. The recruit stopped mid-step, then glanced toward the plaque and shook his head. "I'll wait," he muttered. The officer didn't question him again. No one ever found out who had installed the plaque. Some believed it was the senior staff. Others suspected Reggie. A few even joked that the range had simply birthed it overnight like an offering. But no one asked. It didn't matter. Keanu never brought it up, never acknowledged it in words. But the next week, he brought an extra box of ammo, quietly placed it on a nearby bench, left a small handwritten note taped on top. "For anyone still learning, you're not alone." The note had no signature. Still, they all knew who it came from. The recruits took turns using that box sparingly, as if each round was sacred. Even the label was saved, folded neatly, and pinned to the corkboard in the back training room, next to other standard reminders and safety tips. But this one stood out, not because it was from someone famous, but because it had meaning, weight, a voice in the silence. After that, things began to shift. Conversations among the recruits turned more reflective. Fewer jokes about toughness. More questions about purpose. Morales started staying late to clean the range, even when it wasn't his turn. Jackson started bringing a second pair of gloves, just in case someone forgot theirs. Petty wrote in her notebook between drills notes not about technique, but about focus, patience, humility. And Reggie, once the loudest of them all, now spoke only when necessary. He never told anyone, but every time he entered the range, he tapped the edge of the lane 9 bench gently with his fingertips. A small gesture, one of gratitude, one of respect. The plaque remained, untouched, unsullied, reserved until he says otherwise. And no one ever questioned who he was. They just knew. Because some legacies don't need names to be remembered. They just need silence. And the people willing to listen to it. Reggie came back the following Monday. No announcement, no grand re-entry, just a quiet arrival, 5 minutes before the doors opened. His hoodie was plain, no graphics. His gloves stayed in his bag. He didn't joke with the front desk. He nodded respectfully to the staff, gave Morales a quiet fist bump, and walked to lane 7 without hesitation. Lane 9, of course, was empty. The plaque above it shined softly under the fluorescent light. Reggie didn't even glance at it. He had learned something. Maybe not fully, but enough to change the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he listened. His stance was tighter now, shoulders relaxed but squared. He loaded his magazine slowly, like he wasn't just feeding bullets into metal, but lining up moments of focus. When he raised his arms and took aim, there was no flare, no speed, just steady rhythm. 2 shots, pause, 1 deep breath, 2 more shots, reset. He wasn't trying to perform anymore. He was trying to understand. Jackson noticed first. "His groupings are tighter," he whispered to Petty, who was leaning quietly against the wall. Petty nodded. "More centered too." He's slowing down. They watched for a while without speaking. Reggie's form wasn't perfect, but it had grown sharper, more honest, less forced. Each movement had a weight behind it that wasn't there before. Keanu wasn't on the schedule that day, but no one asked about him. The room had taken on a new code, a rhythm of respect that no longer required presence to be present. Petty stepped up to lane 6. She hadn't planned to shoot that morning. She was dressed more for cardio than for range work, but something shifted in her. Maybe it was Reggie's quiet. Maybe it was the way lane 9 sat empty, like a chapel pew left open. She strapped on her hearing protection, loaded 5 rounds, and took aim. 3 shots landed left of center. She paused, readjusted her footing, then took the last 2. Both hit clean. When she stepped back, she didn't smile, didn't high-five anyone. She just nodded to herself and walked to the side, where Morales was quietly unpacking his gear. Reggie glanced at her between sets, offered no words, just a nod. She returned it. Something had settled between them, some unspoken understanding that didn't need jokes or swagger or declarations, just mutual presence, mutual practice. And when the hour ended, they were still there, talking less, watching more. Reggie stayed behind to collect shells, even though no one asked. Petty helped him without a word. They worked in silence, their movements in sync, like they were sweeping the floor of a dojo, not a shooting range. That became the new pattern. Every week, Reggie showed up early. Petty followed close behind. Sometimes Keanu came, sometimes he didn't. It didn't change the ritual. The lesson had already taken root. Now they were tending it. The 3rd Monday brought rain. Not the kind that canceled plans, but the kind that made you move slower, think more. Reggie arrived soaked from the collar down, but he didn't seem to care. His hoodie was heavy with water. His boots squeaked faintly as he walked to lane 7. He nodded to Morales and gave a small wave to Jackson. Petty was already there, tying her hair back into a loose bun. She'd brought her own gear bag, this time no borrowed mags, no shared targets. She was ready. They didn't talk much before the drills started. They didn't need to. The rhythm picked up again. Reggie fired in slow, steady bursts. He focused on recoil control, not speed. He corrected his stance once mid-set without being told. Petty had begun experimenting with her grip, shifting her thumb slightly for better alignment. Jackson observed from behind, occasionally leaning over to Morales to whisper a quiet note of improvement. That day, something changed again. Between rounds, Reggie asked Morales a question. Not about weapons, but about mindset. How do you stop thinking when you're lining up the shot? Morales didn't rush the answer. He wiped down a bench, then said simply, "You don't stop thinking. You just stop arguing with your thoughts." Reggie looked at him like he'd never heard it said that way before, and maybe he hadn't. Petty overheard and gave a quiet nod. That line stuck with her too. By the 4th week, a few other recruits started joining them earlier. Not for the sake of popularity. There were no selfies, no buzzing phones, just a sense of gravity to the mornings now. A code had formed, and it was silent, but strong. Keanu hadn't been back for 2 sessions, but lane 9 remained untouched. Still, every person who walked through the door glanced at the plaque before they set up. Not because they were told to, it was just understood. Reserved until he says otherwise. It wasn't about fame anymore, or even about Keanu. It was about what his presence had done to the room, to them, to their process. Reggie stopped using the gloves altogether. Petty started bringing a journal. They would shoot for 30 minutes, then sit on the bench, near the lockers and jot down thoughts. Not scores, not stats, just observations. How it felt when they fired, what changed in their breathing. What small shift in posture led to tighter groupings? It was a form of reflection. Quiet, private, but deeply honest. Jackson eventually joined them, not to shoot, but to watch. The guy who once joked about becoming a TikTok range influencer now showed up in plain clothes and listened more than he spoke. And slowly, the atmosphere changed across the board. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. Morales said nothing, but one morning, he left a small sign taped to the wall above the bench. Respect doesn't raise its voice. No one asked where the quote came from. No one needed to. Week by week, Reggie grew more focused. Not perfect, not elite, but grounded. He wasn't trying to earn praise anymore. He was trying to build something inside himself. Petty noticed it first. "You walk different now," she said one morning after they finished. Reggie gave a soft smile. "Feels like I'm walking toward something now, instead of away." That line hung in the air, and it stayed with her, just like the silence that followed. The kind of silence that teaches more than any instructor could, because by now they all knew. The lesson hadn't been about shooting, it had been about presence. And Reggie, finally, was learning how to stay. The calendar flipped with little fanfare. November came quietly, ushered in by dry leaves and cooler mornings. The range, once noisy with idle chatter and scattered movements, had become a sanctuary of sorts. Mondays still belonged to the same few: Reggie, Petty, Morales, Jackson, a few others who now came not for Keanu, but for what remained. And then, one Monday, Lane 9 stayed empty. At first, no one said a word. Sometimes Keanu arrived late. Sometimes he waited outside, listening to the rhythm before entering. But by the end of the first hour, something settled in their bones. Today was different. Reggie noticed it first. The bench was still wiped down, clean as always, but the air around it felt still, like something had closed. He didn't panic, didn't call anyone, didn't text or ask where Keanu had gone. He just felt it. Lane 9 belonged to something more now. It wasn't about one man's presence. It had become a space of memory, a space of change. He walked toward the lane without his usual urgency. No earbuds, no gloves, just his range bag and a single box of ammo, less than half full. Petty watched from behind the divider, but didn't follow. She knew better now. Reggie opened the box slowly, slid one magazine out. He checked the chamber, loaded deliberately. There was no rush in his motions, no desire to perform. He stepped up, aligned his feet with the tape on the floor, and exhaled slowly. Then the rhythm began. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, reset. The echo bounced gently through the range, not sharp or aggressive, measured, intentional. Morales, who had just finished cleaning one of the benches, turned his head and stood quietly. Jackson looked up from the far side and lowered his clipboard. No one interrupted. Reggie continued. 3 more shots, then 2, and silence again. He wasn't trying to fill the absence. He was honoring it. After his second set, he slowly stepped back, ejected the mag, cleared the chamber, set his weapon down. Then, from his pocket, he pulled a single round, a .45 ACP. It glinted faintly under the overhead lights. He walked toward the bench at Lane 9, not the shooting platform, but the wooden bench behind it, the one where Keanu always sat between drills. Reggie placed the round gently in the center. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But in that moment, it meant everything. He stepped back, looked at the plaque above the lane, reserved until he says otherwise. The words hadn't changed, but they now meant something different. Not a placeholder, a promise. Reggie didn't speak. He simply gave a small nod, to the bench, to the plaque, to the presence that still lingered in every inch of the lane. Behind him, Petty wiped her hands with a towel, quietly placing it on her own bench. She understood too. It wasn't about the shot or the shooter. It was about the silence that followed, and the way it echoed when someone finally understood. The following week, Reggie came early. Earlier than usual. He didn't even bring a full loadout, just 1 box of ammo, his sidearm, and a thermos of coffee he didn't drink. Lane 9, as always, remained untouched. And still, he approached it with the same reverence as before. No one asked about Keanu anymore. It wasn't because they didn't care, it was because asking would have diminished what he left behind. His absence was not a void. It was a presence in its own way, a kind of spiritual echo. Reggie stood in front of the lane again. The plaque caught his eye. Its brass shimmered against the black wall. Simple letters, no name, no explanation, just the same message that had etched itself into all of them, reserved until he says otherwise. He ran a hand over it lightly, then stepped back to the familiar place, loaded 5 rounds into his magazine, and began again. 3 shots, pause, 2. The rhythm lived in his bones now, not copied, not mimicked. Absorbed, Petty arrived mid-routine. She didn't wave, didn't interrupt. She just slid into the lane beside him and began her own warm-up, the same sequence. 3. Pause. 2. The rangemaster, who had seen 100 rookies and 1,000 egos, leaned silently in the back, with his arms crossed. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Even Morales and Jackson, once skeptical, now took their time. They approached their lanes with a quiet focus, not competitive, not boastful, respectful. The silence had become instructional, sacred, a language that only those who'd stayed long enough could understand. At the end of the session, Reggie didn't linger. He cleaned up quickly, but before leaving, he did one more thing. From the bottom of his bag, wrapped in a soft cloth, he took out a small wooden case. Inside was a custom-made cartridge, a spent round, polished and engraved. No initials, no grand statement. Just the numbers 3 to 2, separated by a single pause line. He placed it next to the round from the week before. Both now sat like offerings, like reminders. Not everyone noticed them, but those who did paused, and that was enough. That evening, back at home, Reggie sat alone. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't scroll. He just stared at the floor, thinking about the rhythm, the pauses between each burst, the moments between the noise. His mind replayed Keanu's words from weeks ago. Some things you just absorb. He hadn't understood it then, not fully. Now he did. You don't teach respect. You model it. You don't shout legacy. You embody it. You don't chase meaning. You show up consistently until it reveals itself in silence. That was what Keanu had done. That was what the range had become. That was what Reggie would carry forward. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across his quiet room, Reggie finally smiled. Just once, small, but real. Lane 9 would be waiting next week. Whether Keanu returned or not didn't matter anymore. The lesson had already landed, and Reggie was ready to keep passing it on. In a world addicted to noise, some men choose silence. Not out of indifference, but out of intention, out of clarity, out of depth. Keanu Reeves was one of them. He didn't enter the shooting range seeking attention. He didn't ask to be watched, followed, or admired. He showed up quietly, set his gear down, and worked on his rhythm. The same way a musician would return to the same chord progression again and again until it became second nature, until the song lived in his bones. Lane 9 wasn't just a station. It became a statement, a place where ego dissolved, where performance gave way to purpose, where recruits stopped trying to prove something and started trying to learn something. It would have been easier for Keanu to give a speech, to command the room, to demand the respect his name carried. But he didn't. Because real respect isn't demanded, it's offered, it's noticed. It's earned slowly, without theatrics. His legacy wasn't built on volume, it was built on presence. He never pulled Reggie aside to lecture him. He didn't correct him in public or showcase his own superiority. He simply continued, repetition without arrogance, precision without pride, discipline without applause. And that, more than any instruction, changed Reggie. Because presence is a language, a fluent one. spoken through consistent action, unwavering posture, and quiet resolve. In a world obsessed with making a point, Keanu chose to make an example. Others noticed. Petty noticed. Morales, Jackson, even the Rangemaster, hardened by years of bravado and burnout, softened in the presence of someone who didn't need to say a single word to command the room. Week after week, even in his absence, Keanu's presence remained. The plaque above Lane 9, reserved until he says otherwise, wasn't just a placeholder, it was a reminder. A symbol that greatness doesn't need fanfare. That respect doesn't come from titles or ranks or IMDb credits. It comes from how a man carries himself when no one's watching. And even more so, when everyone Island Reggie kept coming. Not for the photos, not for the chance to stand in the same place a movie legend once did, but because something had shifted in him. Something that couldn't be undone. He didn't talk as much anymore. Didn't try to sound impressive. His gear was cleaner, his stance firmer, his shots tighter. But more than that, his spirit was quieter. That kind of change doesn't come from motivation. It comes from modeling. And what Keanu modeled wasn't swagger. It was steadiness. The world didn't need another celebrity sermon. What it needed was proof that quiet strength still mattered. That humility wasn't weakness. That stillness could still speak volumes. Lane 9 had become that proof. One day, months after Keanu's last visit, a group of fresh recruits filed into the range. Young, eager, restless. They laughed, checked their phones, elbowed each other in line. Until they got to Lane 9. Then they stopped. One of them whispered, "This the spot?" Another nodded. They didn't step onto the lane. They stood beside it, studied it. A few removed their hats. One adjusted his belt, suddenly aware of how sloppy he looked. That's what reverence looks like when no one asks for it. When it grows not from fear, but from admiration. Reggie happened to be there that day. He didn't correct them, didn't act like a veteran. He just stood near the back wall, arms crossed, watching the energy shift. Then, quietly, he loaded his weapon and took Lane 10. His rhythm had become familiar, not perfect, but intentional, not rushed. 3 shots, a pause, 2, reset. And every time, that 6th bullet, he left it, placed it on the bench, just like Keanu did. That single unspent round became part of the rhythm now. A symbol, a moment of breath, of honor. Some days, Reggie wouldn't even shoot. He'd just show up, clean his weapon, watch the new recruits, then leave. No words, just presence. And the recruits began to mirror that. Phones stayed in pockets, conversations lowered, even laughter softened. Because Lane 9 wasn't a shrine. It wasn't about worship. It was about awareness. About stepping into a space where you remembered that greatness could be quiet, and mastery didn't need applause. It wasn't long before someone new asked, "Who was he?" And Reggie didn't give them a full biography. He didn't say, "Keanu Reeves, the actor." He didn't list movies or accomplishments. He just smiled a little and said, "Someone worth watching." That was enough. Because when a man lives with that kind of integrity, his story doesn't need explaining. It lives in gestures, in echoes, in the way others carry themselves after he's gone. It lives in Lane 9. So many spend their lives trying to make a name. Keanu made a space. He didn't build monuments. He built memory. He didn't shout to be heard. He just showed up until the silence started speaking for him. And when the day came that he didn't return, it wasn't grief that filled the range. It was reverence. Because those who move the world the most often do so the quietest. In a world that chases volume, Keanu Reeves chose restraint. Where others sought headlines, he sought humility. He never asked to be followed. That's why people followed. His legacy wasn't locked in box office numbers or etched into medals. It lived in how people stood up straighter around him, how they listened more than they spoke, how they realized that respect, the real kind, doesn't come from commanding. It comes from consistency. He didn't teach by lecturing. He taught by returning, again and again, until the lesson landed without ever being spoken. There's a plaque over Lane 9 now. Still reads the same. reserved until he says otherwise, but everyone knows he already said everything he needed to say, without saying a word. If this incredible story moved you, share it with someone who believes respect is earned, not claimed. Type respect in the comments if you believe quiet strength speaks the loudest. And if you've ever learned something from someone who didn't teach with words, but with presence, tell us their story. We want to hear. Because sometimes, the most incredible stories are the ones that whisper, and still, somehow, echo forever.